Hey, everybody. Thanks for hopping on today. Looks like we got some people on Zoom, nobody in the room. So, if you guys have any questions throughout the presentation, just unmute yourself. I'm not good at monitoring the chat. Um, so, um, if you put something in the chat, there's a good chance I won't see it. So, feel free to unmute, interrupt me. It's all good. Okay, so we're teaching purchase agreements today, right? Is that what we were? Yeah, purchase agreements. Okay. Um, so I'm not doing a dot loop class, so you guys will have to know how to set up your dot loop to get everything there. Do I hide this bar? Um, there it goes. All right, so you guys will have to set up your dot loop and folders and stuff so that you have it all in there. Um, and let me open up. All right, so I'm going to go through this kind of like as if we were uh, writing an offer, as if you guys were the buyer. First thing I have in here, well, this wouldn't be for the buyer to see. See, this is your checklist. This is an outdated one, so hopefully when you guys get the checklist, you're using the more current one. But there is a checklist for all the documents that you need to have, and these are the required documents. These are the optional documents down here. Obviously, if it's FHA or VA, if it's a condo, those things will have to be added as needed. Then the next document is the Consumer Guide to Agency Relationships. We should all be presenting this to our buyer. Actually, before we get to this point where we're writing the offer, we should be giving them the Consumer Guide to Agency um, uh, at our first time meeting with them so that they understand our fiduciary responsibilities. And I think most importantly, confidentiality. Because when we start talking to them, if they don't hire us and they've told us something that should have been maintained confidential, you don't owe them that fiduciary responsibility if you're not working with them. So they need to understand this before you start working with them, before they talk about anything confidential. When I present this form to a buyer, I usually just say, this is a form that's required by the state of Ohio. It's not a contract. I'm going to ask you to sign it today, and this is not a contract. It just explains how I work as a real estate agent in the state of Ohio. I could represent a seller. So if I have a listing, I do represent that seller, and here's a list of my fiduciary responsibilities for that seller. In this case, we're going to be working together with you as my buyer. So this explains what my duties are to you as a buyer's agent. There is something called dual agency, which is when I represent both parties. So if you happen to find a house that, if you find a house that you like and I happen to be the listing agent, then I would be what we call a dual agent, where I'm representing both of you guys. And both you and the seller would have to agree to that. If one of you guys do not agree to have me represent both of you, then either you, Mr. Buyer, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you can choose to be unrepresented. And I'll treat you honestly and fairly, but I won't owe you the duty of confidentiality and all these duties that I owe to my clients. I wouldn't owe this to you. However, I would treat you honestly and fairly. If you aren't comfortable with being unrepresented, we'll just find another agent in my office. We'll refer you to them, and they will be happy to represent you. So that's how I present it to the buyers. And then I'm going to ask you to sign down here that I usually say there's also a fair housing statement. It goes over all the protected classes. And then I'm going to ask you to sign this. Again, it's not a contract. It's just in case the state of Ohio decides to audit me, that I can show that I presented this to you already. Sorry, my phone needs to go on do not disturb. Okay. Questions about the consumer guide? Okay, I will move on to the agency disclosure. So again, talking to you guys as if you guys are my buyers. So this is the agency disclosure. It's very similar to the last document that I showed you, except this is now the start of our contract. This basically says this is the address that you're buying. This is you as the buyer, and this is the seller's name. This form is going to show us who's representing who. So you are the buyer represented by Rick Tannenbaum from the brokerage Keller Williams. The seller is represented by John Doe from ABC Realty. So that's how I explain this form. And then obviously if we're the same, if you're selling something that's represented by a Keller Williams living agent, you would go into section 2 and say, we use section 2, the first part of section 2. Agent Rick Tannenbaum works with the buyer, and agent, I don't know, pick any one of you guys. Your name here represents the seller. And we each represent our own clients. So, but the brokerage itself will be a dual agent. If you're selling FSBO where you're the only agent, or if somebody's unrepresented, you could use section 3. Or if you're a dual agent. So section 3 is only one agent. Rick Tannenbaum from Keller Williams will be a dual agent. I represent both parties. Or I only represent one party. If it's a FSBO, I only represent the buyer. If it's an unrepresented buyer, I only represent the seller. You can explain that to them as you're filling this form out when you run into that scenario, and then they sign there. And here's our statement on dual agency. And questions about that form before I move on to the purchase agreement? Nope. Okay, moving on. So this is the part that takes me the longest to explain to my buyers, and in this class, it's going to take me the longest time to get through this part of it too. Because these next 5 or 6 pages is kind of the meat and potatoes of everything. So buyer's name, you're going to put your buyer's name up here, and the property address is going to go here, and the parcel number, make sure you check the parcel number. If there's multiple parcel numbers, fill in multiple parcel numbers into this field. You're buying the house as is. You get the right to know what is as is. We're going to talk about inspections in a couple pages from now, but this just says you're buying it as is, but it does include all the fixtures. And here's what fixtures are included, and some of these are personal property that's included. But all electrical, heating, air conditioning, plumbing, bathroom fixtures, all windows and shades, blinds, awnings, screens, storm windows, curtains, landscaping, blah, blah, blah. If you're presenting this to a seller, you might also, we've had a few sellers that have taken out landscaping from their house. So you might want to make sure that they understand that landscaping is considered a fixture, even though it's not attached to the house, it's attached to the property. And then the following items will also remain. So you'll go through and check if they're leaving, if your offer is included the kitchen appliances, washer, dryer, if there's window air conditions that you're including, screens for the fireplace, glass doors, grates, all existing window treatment, ceiling fans, whatever you're including, check the appropriate box. If there's something that you're including that is not listed up here, either in the words that are printed out or one of the check boxes that you have to check, then you can add it in here. So chattel included. Chattel, for those of you who don't know, is just a fancy name for personal property. So I recently sold a house. We included a pool table and an air hockey table that was in the basement. We wrote it in under chattel. So that is included in the sale. If your client's getting financing and you have something like that pool table or air hockey table or a piece of art hanging on the wall or a couch, whatever it is, if it's personal property and your client is getting a mortgage, I strongly recommend that you write in there, which has no value. So mine said the pool table in the basement, which has no value. Um, the reason I do that is because the bank is not financing your pool table for you. And if it's in there, then it's going to likely cause problems with your financing and your appraisal. They're going to back out what they perceive the value of that pool table to be. And then you're going to be short on your appraisal. So I always add in, which has no value. Obviously, between my buyer and my seller and the seller, we know that there is value to those things, but we write it that way just so that it doesn't cause problems with financing. Excluded fixtures, if the seller is taking something that is included in the above, so they're taking the I don't know what is there. They're they're taking some window shades with them for whatever reason. You can exclude it here. They're taking the dining room chandelier with them. You can exclude it there. So that's what this section would be for. All right. Excuse me. Secondary offer. I don't know that you guys are going to use this very often or ever. In 17 years, I don't know that I've ever I probably used it, but never gotten one accepted with a secondary offer. But if you're writing a secondary offer, you check this first box. If it's not a secondary offer, you check the second box. And all that means is that they've accepted somebody else's offer. You wrote an offer as a backup so that in the event that that deal falls apart for any reason whatsoever, whether it's financing or whether it's inspections or maybe the buyer gets cold feet, but as soon as there's a mutual release signed on that first buyer, the property does not go back on the market. The seller is just going to notify you. You're going to be in the primary position for that purchase. If you use this, you're going to want an end date. You don't want your buyer to be tied up indefinitely. So, you might say, okay, you accepted somebody else's offer. They've got 7 days for inspections, 10 days or 3 more days to negotiate that inspection. My secondary offer is going to be valid for 11 days, 12 days. Give them an opportunity to see if they can't get through the inspection contingency, then but you can make that whatever date you want. Just know that your buyer is going to be tied up a little bit. So purchase price, what are you offering? Earnest money. I usually say like 1%. But it's up to you guys if you want to do less than 1. It's up to your buyer, really. If you want to do less than 1%, if you want to do more than 1%, depending on how much they like the house, if they want to make it a more attractive offer, put more earnest money. We do not accept earnest money at the office. So under no circumstances will that earnest money check be written to Keller Williams Living. I typically check wired funds to the escrow agent, so they don't even have to write a check, period, at all. It goes straight to the title company, and it's due within 4 days of acceptance. So you'll see up here, 4 days from acceptance is when that earnest money needs to be deposited. You'll want to pay attention to that date. Dates we count as calendar days, not business days. So if you need to give somebody extra time because it's Christmas or because it's a weekend and you're losing 2 days or whatever the case may be, there's some sort of holiday, so it's a long weekend. Make sure you keep that in mind. It's calendar days. And we count days as today is the day of acceptance. Today would be day 0. Tomorrow would be day 1. So that's how we count days.
If we wanted to change the amount of days for that, are we allowed to cross that out and put a different amount of days?
Yep. You
Okay.
should be able to just go into the add up here, add strike through, strike out 4, add a text box, or you can just skip the strike through and just put the text box right over the word 4, put in 5 days. Just make sure if you make any changes like that, everybody's initialed it.
Okay, even like the seller, the buyer, everybody.
Everybody, yep. Buyer and
Gotcha.
seller both need to initial that change if you do that change.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. I don't know how to get rid of this. Okay. Um, so that's your earnest money, cash down payment to be deposited with the escrow agent. It's got a dollar sign here. If you guys are doing financing, I usually just put a percentage. So let's say they're doing 10% down, I'll put 10% here, 90%. You can do dollar amounts if you want. You can do percentages like that. You might do 10% or more. And then instead of having 90%, you might put balance. You can do it a number of ways. If it's financed, just that's how we do that. Okay. And if it's cash, then what I would do for cash is I would take purchase price minus the earnest money. That's the number that's going in here. And then $0 for mortgage. That's how I would do a cash offer. Mortgage type, conventional FHA, VA, cash. Those are all pretty self-explanatory. And then there's other. Other I would use for something like if your buyer's getting a hard money loan, if they're doing like a DSCR for investors, those debt service ratio loans, debt service debt service coverage ratio loan, which is what a lot of investors are doing for rental properties. So you can check other for that. So that's how you private loan, something like that would all go in other. All right. There's a little statement about the Good Funds Act. In Ohio, we're not allowed to accept any deposits over $10,000. So make sure that I'm sorry, we're not allowed to accept deposits over $10,000 via check. So make sure they understand they can't write a check for their closing, the funds that they need to close if it's over $10,000. Usually the title company will want that wired even if it's under 10,000. But if your earnest money is 11,000, there's not even an option to write a check to the title company. It's going to have to be a wire transfer. Electronic data security. This is an important paragraph because it tells your client that, look, there's a lot of wire fraud going around. And if you ever get an email from me, your agent, asking you to send funds somewhere or giving you wire instructions to send the funds somewhere, don't trust it. Call me. And don't send that money, because once you wire that, if that's not the right wire instructions, that money's gone. Okay, so just make sure they understand the only people that are going to be reaching out to your buyers with wire instructions should be the title company. Most title companies, not all, but most title companies will block out the last 3 or 4 numbers of their wire instructions so that you're forced to call them and say, is this really from you, and what's the last 4 digits, so that that you're sending it to the right place. It'll also come through a security email from the title company, not just a regular email. So make sure your clients are aware that there's wire fraud going on, and we as agents will never ask to wire any funds. I shouldn't say never ask to wire funds. We'll ask them to wire their funds, but we won't be providing those wire instructions. Okay. Financing. So this is your finance contingency. So I usually fill it the way I fill it out, and there's different ways that you can do it, but I usually fill out buyer's going to make a written loan application within 5 days, and then a written loan commitment. The way I do it, now I'm showing my cards to you guys if we ever negotiate a deal together, but I usually try to make this date for the loan commitment to line up with our closing date. So if we're closing in 45 days, let's say we're closing on March 31st, I'm going to put in March 30th maybe on my finance, my loan commitment, the finance contingency period. Um, that's how I do it. I also tell my buyers, look, that may not be the most reasonable thing to write in here, but I work for the buyer, not the seller. So if a seller comes back and gives us a counter offer, I think it's reasonable to put in like 21 to 30 days for your loan commitment, and that's when your finance contingency will expire. So closing. If we're using American Title, you just fill in NA here. So this is our title company that we're using. So if we're using American Title Solutions, you can just put NA in this box. If you're using somebody else, you can put in the name of the title company that you are using into this line here. And all funds and documents will be deposited with that title company on or before. What I would do is I would have this our day of closing. So using the same date, I said March 31st, that's a Sunday. So let's say March 29th, we're closing. I'm going to put March 29th as the day that all funds and documents need to be deposited. And then title shall transfer to the buyer on or about. I'm going to say March 29th. So in my case, both of these days line up the same. I know some agents like to put in, a day or two before the money's due. So you're going to make your deposit on March 28th, and we're going to close the next day on March 29th. That's entirely up to you, and how you guys want to do it and how your buyers are comfortable doing it. Okay. We're going to do a walkthrough of the property. This is your final walkthrough. I'll usually put 1 to 3 days. Oops, what did I do with this text box? Okay, I'll usually fill in 1 to 3 days before title transfer. So I've got a closing this week on Thursday. I'm taking my buyers for a walkthrough this afternoon. So we're 2 days before, so we're within our time frame. The walkthrough, the purpose of the walkthrough is to make sure that the property is in the same or similar condition as it was during your inspection, minus normal wear and tear, and added in any repairs that you may have negotiated during your inspection contingency. So if they had to fix the mold in the attic needed to be cleaned up, this is our opportunity to see that they clean the mold in the attic. Okay. It is not an opportunity to raise new issues. So if there was a plumbing leak during your home inspection and you didn't ask for it to be repaired, this is not your chance to ask for that to be repaired. This is not to raise new issues. This is just to make sure that there are no new issues in the property. That toilet wasn't leaking when we did our inspection. Now it's leaking. That's a new defect. That's something that you need to, a seller, we want you to address it. So that's the purpose of the final walkthrough. Okay. Possession. In an ideal world, the way that I do possession of the property, I'll write 0 days after the recording of the deed, transferring the property from the seller to the buyer, or March 29th, using the same date, whichever is later. In other words, if we don't close on March 29th, we close on April 1st instead, then April 1st is the later of the 2 dates, so that's when you get possession. Okay. This isn't an ideal world. Unfortunately, in this market, we don't always have the luxury of doing that because a lot of sellers don't know where they're going, or they can't close on their next home until they have the proceeds from this home, whatever the case may be. So sometimes that gets a little tricky there. If you do that, if you do a seller possession post title transfer, then what I would do here is I would say see addendum in both of these blocks on line 75, see addendum, and line 76, see addendum. And then we do have there's an addendum in the folder in that loop that's called Ohio statewide contracts. And there's a seller post title transfer, occupancy post title transfer addendum in there that you can use for that purpose. Okay. Title, this paragraph just tells our clients that you're going to get a clean title. There's not going to be any liens or encumbrances on the property. The title company's job is to make sure that they are able to give you clean title to the property. If there's a defect in the property, in the title of the property, the seller will have 30 days after written notice to remove that title defect. If they're unable to do so, then the buyer has to make a decision. Are you going to accept the property with the defect? Maybe you renegotiate a purchase price because of a defect, or you can terminate the agreement altogether. So there is an option for the buyer how to move forward if the seller cannot remove that title defect.
I'm sorry, Rick, I have a quick question.
Sure.
What was that the name of the addendum that you talked about?
I don't remember the exact name of it, but it's something along the lines of seller occupancy post title transfer, something along the lines. It actually may be one of the documents that we're going to review here today. Actually,
Okay.
I'll make sure that we review it here today. If it's not already in this packet of stuff, then we can open that up after as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Okay. Prorations. This part gets confusing to most of my buyers. Well, the easy part is this paragraph talks about all the accounting. So if there's a tenant in the property and there's a security deposit, you're going to get the credit for that through escrow. If the tenant paid rent on the first of the month and we're closing in the middle of the month, whether it's the 10th or 15th or 29th, even if we close using that same example of March 29th, they paid March rent, but you own to the seller, you own the house on the 29th, 30th, and 31st of March, you're entitled to 3 days of rent. So we're going to make sure that we credit you at closing for 3 days of rent plus a security deposit if there is. Same thing goes for homeowners associations or condo associations. So if there's any fees for the association paid, that will also get prorated to you at closing. So, or in that case, the seller paid it and you owe 3 days of the HOA. So you're going to give the seller a credit for that time when you own it. And then the part that gets confusing to most of my buyers is taxes. So the way we pay taxes in the state of Ohio is we're paying a year behind. We pay twice a year in February and July. The February payment, which just got paid, that was for the first half of 2023. So in theory, Mr. Buyer, this seller has already paid the first bill, which would cover from January 1 to June 30th of 2023. They have not paid anything for property taxes for July 1st of 2023 up until through and including the day of closing, which will be March 29th. They haven't paid it because it's not due. When that comes due in July and you're the new owner of the house, the county is going to send you the tax bill and you're going to have to pay it. We're going to give you a credit for that at closing. So the seller is going to give you a credit in this case of approximately 9 months of taxes, so that when you get the bill in July for the second half of 2023, you have the money from the seller to make that payment. Then the next bill will be for the first half of 2024. They owned it for the first 3 months. You've already got that money credited from them at closing. That's usually a little confusing for a consumer to understand how we pay taxes here in Ohio, especially if you're working with any out-of-state clients. I think Ohio is pretty unique in the way we bill our taxes, so it gets pretty confusing for people. The other part in here that is important for you to know as a buyer is this escrow hold from the seller for the final water and sewer charges. I'll explain it to a buyer saying, you know, if when the seller moves out, if they choose not to pay their final electric bill or gas bill, not your problem. You'll turn on service into your name for gas and electric. those companies can send collection agencies after the seller for whatever they owe them. That's not your problem. But water and sewer stick with the property. So if the seller skips town without paying their final water and sewer bill, now it's going to become your problem to deal with. So what we do to make sure that they don't leave town without paying that bill is we hold back $200, might do $300, whatever you're comfortable with, or your buyers are comfortable with. I usually do 200. So we're going to hold back $200 from the seller's proceeds. It's going to be held by the escrow agent. And basically that's just going to be your insurance that they pay that final bill and don't leave it for you to deal with. All right. If you guys are selling anything in rural areas, then you might have to deal with this last sentence here too, which is the agricultural recoupment tax. I'll be honest, I am not very smart when it comes to that, because I mostly sell in Cuyahoga County. But I know there are areas, rural areas, where if you have a farm, you get some sort of exemption from some sort of agricultural tax. But if the use ever changes, so if I've got a farm and I got this exemption, I've not been paying the taxes on whatever that tax may be for the agricultural piece of it. You're buying the property from me, you're gonna get rid of my farm and put up a housing development. It's no longer being used as a farm. There is some sort of clawback where you have to go back a few years and take care of whatever that credit was that you had received while it was in agricultural use. So who's going to pay that, the buyer or the seller? You need to know if it is going to change and you're going to have to pay back some agricultural tax. Make sure your buyer knows that they're going to have to pay it back, or if it's going to be the seller who's going to pay it back. Okay. Charges through escrow. So since this is really a class for how to work with buyers, I'm going to skip this paragraph here on line 106. I'm going to go down to line 113. This is your buyer's closing costs. This is what your buyer's going to have to pay and they need to know about. Unless it's prohibited by FHA or VA, they're going to pay half of the escrow fee, which is typically, I don't know, like $395 to $425, somewhere maybe $450, somewhere in that range, depending on the title company you use. Half of the insuring premium of the owner's fee policy of title insurance. This is another one, excuse me, that always gets confusing to buyers to understand this. So the way I explain it is the owner's policy of title insurance is an insurance policy that you pay one time. It's not like your homeowner's insurance that you pay every year, every month. This is one time when you buy the house. It covers you for as long as you own the house. You own the house for 2 years. If you own the house for 100 years, it's covering you at that point. It's making sure that you're really the rightful owner and that all your things are actually on your property. Title insurance would protect you when somebody says, oh, I'm the ex-spouse of 3 owners ago and I never signed the quitclaim deed when we got divorced, so I still own this property, get out of my house. They would have the right to the property, and your title insurance, the title company should have discovered that problem. And if they didn't, that's where the title insurance comes in. A more realistic example that I've actually seen a couple times in the past year or so is the fence. There's a fence on the property and the fence goes over the property line. Now your neighbor behind you says, hey, you need to move this fence off of my property. They may, depending on the circumstances of how long that fence has been there, they may or may not have to move that fence. If your title insurance policy was there and it's decided that you do in fact have to move your fence 2 feet into your property, that's where the title insurance would pay for the moving that fence. Okay. So that's the title insurance piece. You're going to pay for all recording fees for the deed and any mortgages. If you're getting a mortgage, I usually tell people to budget $225, $250. It's Cuyahoga County. I think it's $4 a page. your mortgage, your deed is only going to be like 3 pages long, 2 to 3 pages long, but your mortgage, you never know how many pages that's going to be. So I tell people usually budget around 225, 250 for that. Hopefully it's less, but use that as a budget. Our buyer agent commission is comprised of two components: the cooperating compensation payable to the listing brokerage and $295 from the buyer through escrow. We are going to most likely be changing our purchase agreement here soon, and this is one of the lines that is likely to change. But for now, this is what it is. So the cooperating compensation obviously is what you are receiving from the MLS. If you have a buyer's agreement with them, you might want to talk about, you have signed a exclusive right to represent buyer's agreement, and it says that I'm getting 3%. Um, and the MLS is only paying me 1%, so you're going to pay me the 2%. This is your opportunity to talk about that. Um, and and then all of our clients always pay $295 additional commission. So you're getting all your commission through the MLS, through the listing brokerage. Great, but the buyer still owes you $295. Jumping back up for a second to line 113, where it says unless prohibited by VA and FHA. So this 295 is prohibited by VA and FHA. So we waive it only for VA and FHA buyers. So if your buyer is VA or FHA, they're not paying it and you're not paying it either. If you choose to waive that 295 for one of your clients who's not VA, FHA, bank owned, short sales, one of the other exemptions, I think Divvy was one of our exemptions from it. So if you choose to waive it, that's your decision, that's your business decision. You're more than welcome to do that. You just need to understand that if it's not one of those exempt categories, it's going to come out of your commission. So I, for example, have an investor who buys a lot of homes with me, and he fights me about that 295 additional commission every single time. I waive it for him. And when the commission comes into the office, Keller Williams is still receiving the 295. I'm receiving 295 less on my commission. And that's a business decision I've made because he buys enough properties through me that I feel comfortable waiving it for him. But so if you ever decide to waive it, you're more than welcome to do that. But just understand that it's gonna, you're the one paying it if it's not exempt otherwise. Questions about closing costs? Okay. Home warranty. Is there a home warranty? Is it off? Check the MLS if they're offering it. If they're offering it, I check elects. If they're not offering it, then you have to make a decision. If you're gonna, you can always, even if it's not offered in the MLS, you can still ask for it. It's all negotiable in a purchase agreement. So, or if you don't want one, you can check no. If they're offering in the MLS, I'm going to write in here warranty from. Now you can either write seller's choice because they've chosen the home warranty that they're offering you. You can call the listing agent, find out what warranty is being provided, and you can write in the name here and what's the cost. So we know that if it's America's Preferred Home Warranty, it's $499. If it's I don't know, if they're offering Old Republic, you can either find out what it costs or you can write per contract. Usually what I'll do is I'll just write seller's choice at a cost of per contract, and then who's paying for it, seller or buyer. So you'll check that box as appropriate. Inspections. So like we talked about before, you're buying the house as is, but here we're going to talk about your home inspections because you get the right to know what is as is. Here's our list of home inspections. I'm going to check a general home inspection within 7 days at the buyer's expense. I'll usually check radon and other. Radon, I usually say 10 days. Other, I'll say 10 days. Check buyers paying for that. And under other, I'll specify it as any other inspection. Okay, so this is how I typically do it if you're working in mostly um in the city or suburbs. This is probably how you'll fill it out. Check no on these. If you're working in um if you're selling something that has a septic system, you can check septic, and 7 or 10 days is usually plenty for the septic. Same thing with water potability. If you're selling a property, maybe you're in Geauga County where you're on septic and well, you'll check all three of these. Um, and typically your general home inspector should be able to do those inspections as well, at least the water potability and flow rate. So the flow rate is literally just making sure that the well is pumping out enough water. The water potability, they take a sample, send it to a lab, usually comes back within 24 hours, or if it's a weekend, it might take a little bit longer. Um, just to make sure there's no bacteria, make sure that water's safe to drink. Any other
For
home inspection?
these,
I'm sorry, somebody
I'm sorry, I
unmuted?
did have a question. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
So for these inspections, what resource do we use as agents to determine what county or city requires what?
Yeah, so typically if you're on city water, you're not doing water potability or well flow. I mean, there's no reason if you're on city water, you would never do a well flow rate. And frankly, there's really no reason to do a water potability test if you're on city water, because the city is testing the water on a regular basis at their treatment plants. So you'll just have to know if it's on public water or well. Okay. So that's how you would decide if you're going to do these two inspections. And then septic, I would say same thing. I mean, you may find um, like Pepper Pike, Moreland Hills, Hunting Valley, for example. You might find even in Cuyahoga County some septic systems. Um, that's a little more common than the well in Cuyahoga County, for example. Um, so you'll just need to know. And then as far as who can test for septic, if I'm selling a house that's on septic, I'm calling the same company that we would call to pump it out. So I would tell my client, there's several different companies that clean septics. When you have a septic system, you need to have it pumped out every couple of years. So those are the companies that can do that test. They basically flush toilets, make sure it comes out into the septic system, make sure the septic system is moving things along properly to clean out the sewage before the clean water goes back into the ground. Um, I don't know what they do, but they do it. So does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Any other inspection recommended by the general home inspector? I usually tell my client, look, that leaves you wide open for anything else. If the general home inspector sees something that they're unfamiliar with, they'll tell you to get it further evaluated. That's your open door. The reason I have 7 days for general home and 10 days for others, if you end up having your general home on the very last day on day 7 and they say, hey, there's some suspicious cracks, you might want a structural engineer to come out. Now you've got 3 extra days to do that. It really leaves the door wide open. So line 157, you're waiving the right to all inspections except for the ones that are checked yes above. And the way that I wrote the other, it really leaves the door again wide open that you need a mold inspector, you need a structural engineer, you need an electrician or a roofer. You have that right. So they'll initial there. And then what happens after your inspections are all completed? So we've completed our inspections. Now, one of three things is going to happen. The buyer will elect one of the following options: remove the inspection contingency and accept the property in its as-is condition. We did our inspection. There's no big surprises. We want to move forward. We agreed we'll pay you 300. We are happy to keep this thing moving forward and still give you the 300. No repairs needed. Great. That happens sometimes, not as much as it used to. Most of the time, what happens is option B, you accept the property subject to the seller's repairs of specific conditions or defects identified in a written inspection report by a professional inspector or contractor. So we found mold in the attic. We'll still give you the 300,000 that we agreed on, as long as you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, clean the mold in the attic, and as long as it's done by a professional with a warranty, you can word it however you want. Um, we found double tapped breakers. As long as you fix the electrical defects, we'll still move forward. Or maybe, you know what, we found mold, we found electrical problems, we'll buy the house as is, but our offer of 300 is now reduced to 290, and we're going to be responsible for those defects. That's usually what happens, is option B. It happens more than anything else. Option C is the buyer can choose to just terminate. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but it does every once in a while. By the way, if there's a material defect, you don't even have to ask for it to be repaired. As long as there's a material latent defect that was not disclosed in writing by the seller or any of the brokers or agents. So an example would be, I sold a house once. We noticed the floor was sloping, but we didn't know why or what was going on. We didn't know if it was normal settling or if there was something else going on. We did our home inspection. The home inspector said, call a structural engineer. We called the structural engineer. He said, yeah, basically what's happening is there's a bedroom over the garage. The garage is settling this way, the house is settling that way, basically pulling the two structures apart. There's a structural defect there. There's a solution to it. Doesn't mean that the house has to be torn down. The engineer came back with his report and said, yes, there's a defect here. Here's how you fix it. You tie this to that, whatever. This is what you have to do. My clients were not comfortable with it. The seller even, so we asked to terminate the contract. The seller even came back and said, look, we'll fix it to the specifications of your structural engineer who inspected it and their report. We'll do it exactly how he said it should be done. My client said, thanks, but no thanks. We're not comfortable living in the house. Even if it's repaired the way that he said it should be repaired, we're just not comfortable with it. We had the right to terminate. The seller was willing to work with us and willing to take care of it. Frankly, they probably did after we terminated the contract. I'm assuming they did. But we didn't have to accept that. So we had the right to terminate because it was not previously disclosed that there was a structural defect. These 3 bullet points kind of go over those 3 options, which I have already gone over. The only thing that's worth mentioning here is that it does say that if you're going to ask for repairs or you're going to ask to terminate, it does say that we have to provide a copy of that written report to the seller. I know that a lot of sellers or sellers agents don't want to see it because they don't want to have to disclose something else that maybe is in that report. I'll leave that up to you guys, but if you guys get into a fight over whether you're going to be able to terminate or not, just know that the contract says you have to provide that. Okay. It also says if you ask for any repairs in the second bullet point, so we have 3 days to decide what we're doing, option 1, 2, or 3. And if you're taking option 2 to ask for the seller to make repairs, we have an additional 3 days to agree in writing about which defects are going to be repaired. So I'll buy the house for the 300 as long as you clean the mold and fix the plumbing problem and fix the electrical problem. Seller comes back and says, I'll clean the mold and the electrical, but not the plumbing. As long as all of that back and forth negotiation happens within 3 days of our initial request, we're fine. If it exceeds those 3 days, then our contract becomes null and void. There is an argument to be made that as long as we are still in conversations, that it's not really a null and void contract, that because we've been negotiating, we needed 4 days or 5 days to figure it all out. There might be an argument to be made for that. I'd rather that you guys not be the ones to test that out in a court. So I would suggest if it looks like you're getting to the end of the 3 days and everybody in good faith is going back and forth and still negotiating, just make an addendum that says the days to agree to the removal of contingency is extended through whatever, 5 days, or put a calendar date. Okay. Pest and wood destroying insects. I typically check no on this box. And when I explain that to a buyer, I usually say, look, there's a lot of language in here that I haven't seen a problem with, but I don't want you to be the first one to have a problem with it. We can say you have the right to an pest inspection, buyer's choice of who's doing the inspection, and buyer's going to pay for the inspection, and any repairs will be paid by the seller. That sounds great for the buyer, right? You're going to do the inspection, they're going to fix any problems, except if the cost exceeds $500, whoever's paying for that can terminate. So great, we agreed that you're gonna fix those pest and wood destroying insect issues, but we got an estimate for $501. Seller can just terminate, and I don't know, that doesn't, and if it's $450 and your buyer's not comfortable because of whatever was going on, they don't necessarily have the right to back out because of the pest inspection. So for those reasons, I don't like this paragraph, and I usually check no, but I always explain to my buyers, reminding them that back up here, we said any other inspection recommended by the general home inspector. So if the general home inspector recommends having a pest inspection, they should have the right to do that. Okay. Lead, make sure that you guys have a copy of the lead paint disclosure if the house was built prior to 1978. Make sure that they have a copy of protecting your family from lead in the home. We have a copy of that in .loop that you can share with them. They can also go read it on EPA.gov. If they want that lead inspection, they check yes, you check yes here. If not, check no. By the way, I don't know anybody none of my buyers have ever checked for lead paint. The EPA also says that if you find lead in the house, that you should make sure it's not peeling or chipping and that it should be encapsulated. Well, we stopped using lead in 1978. So how many times has that house been painted since 1978? But leave it up to them. It's their comfort level if they want to check for lead or not. Buyer has received a copy of the EPA pamphlet and the disclosure form. They'll initial here. Or if they don't have a copy of that disclosure and it's needed, then you'll check has not received it. They'll initial, and then I usually write, I don't know, 3 days seems fine. You have 3 days to review it. Honestly, these lead paint disclosures, hopefully we've all seen them. They take about 10 seconds to review. Seller has no knowledge, seller has no reports. That's all I usually say. That might start to change. Seller might have knowledge and sellers might have reports because Cleveland's already doing the lead safe program. I think Cleveland Heights just adopted. I don't know that it's been started yet, but they're doing something similar in Cleveland Heights. So now income producing properties are going to be subject to lead inspections in the city of Cleveland. So we might find more and more sellers actually having knowledge and having disclosure of lead in the house. Megan's Law. If the sellers ever received a notice about a sex offender living in the neighborhood, they have to disclose that to you, to your buyer. I always tell my buyers they would have that knowledge if they've received a postcard. Not every sex offender gets a postcard sent out. So if you're concerned about sex offenders living in the neighborhood, you can go to the sheriff's website and search for sex offenders in the area too. Most counties, I know for sure Cuyahoga County, I think most of the counties, you can even put in an address and search a radius, whether it's 1 mile, 2 miles, whatever. And they can usually do a radius search around the property that they're buying if they're concerned about that. This paragraph here on line 222 talks again about buying the property in its as-is physical condition, including any defects to the property. And that the seller has filled out the residential property disclosure forms to disclose any defects that they're aware of. So buyer has received it or has not received it. They have not received it. I usually put 5 days in there. This one you might need a little bit more time because if you didn't get it when you wrote the offer and now they're providing you a big list of disclosures of defects that they're aware of, now you might want a little bit more time to read through it, to think it through, to make sure that you're comfortable with it. So I usually put 5 days in there for that if we have not yet received it. Seller will deliver the property in broom clean condition, free and clear from all debris. So I explained to my buyers, hey, that means, look, they're not going to hire a professional cleaning company to come in and scrub the floors when they move out, but they can't leave trash. They can't leave any personal property in the home. It should be clean, but don't expect, a spotless, mopped floors and everything else. Broom clean. Okay. It also says in here that seller will comply with all point of sale laws and ordinances. The buyer's responsible for checking with the local government if there are any point of sale requirements or violations. If you're buying a property and that you're intending for it to be either violation free or you're intending to assume violations, whatever your intention is, I usually say just make an addendum. If it's going to be violation free, you can, I think this paragraph kind of covers that, but I would just be extra clear, and you can even just put a text box here and say property to be violation free, point of sale compliant at the time of title transfer. Here this says if the sellers get any new violations between the time of making the offer and the time of closing, the city came by and cited them for that cracked concrete, let's just say. We have 5 days after the receipt of the receipt from the seller to the buyer to agree who's going to be responsible for that. So if it's something like the driveway is crumbling, now the city cited it. If I was a listing agent, I'd say, hey, you guys already knew this. You saw that it's all crumbled and falling apart, and you even already got through your home inspections. Like you knew what it is, so we're not doing it. That might be fair. But if it's something new that wasn't discovered by you and it wasn't blatantly obvious, then I would say most likely we're going to stick it to the seller. So that's this paragraph. Representations and disclaimers. Basically, nobody's made any disclaimers about the condition of the property. The agents, the brokers, nobody's told you about the condition of the property except for what you've done in your own due diligence and what's on the property disclosures, whatever the seller had already disclosed to you. Damages to the property. I've had to deal with this paragraph one time, and I hope that none of you ever have to deal with this paragraph. But if the property is damaged between the time of contract and closing in excess of 10% of the purchase price, then the buyer can either accept the insurance proceeds for the damages and complete the transaction, or they can terminate the contract. If it's less than 10%, then the seller has to put it back into the prior condition. I had a house during one of those polar vortexes. The seller had already moved out. The thermostat was actually set to 70 degrees, but the laundry room plumbing was on an exterior wall, and it froze and nobody was living in the house. And the neighbor called and said, hey, I hear water running in the house. And it was a big mess, and it was not fun to deal with. So I hope that none of you guys have to deal with this paragraph. But and then we're going to check all the addendums that we're including. So we should always have a agency disclosure. In most cases, we have a property disclosure form. If you're VA or FHA buyers, if you're condo, there's addendums for that. If we have a lead paint disclosure, we'll check that. And other would be an affiliated business arrangement disclosure notice or an ABA. It might be, you may have written an addendum about point of sale compliant or assuming violations, whatever you may have written, you might call that addendum A. So you'll fill that out. Once we sign it, it's a binding agreement. Here it says days are defined as calendar days, which I already told you guys, but here it says it very clearly in the contract. So, and then buyer will sign, and then once it's accepted, seller will sign down here. For the earnest money, you're gonna check payable to the escrow agent. Again, we're not gonna accept any checks here at Keller Williams, so it should always go to the escrow agent. Fill in all of your information and your licensing numbers and everything here. That's the purchase agreement. That was the hard part to get through. Any questions up until now? Okay. This is our ABA. This is, so you guys should all know that we are affiliated with American Title Solutions. So this is our ABA. If you're using American Title Solutions, this form must be included in your packet of stuff. If you're not using American Title Solutions, then you don't need this. If you're using somebody that you have a personal affiliation with, then you should have your own. American Title will not start your orders unless they have this form in advance. For your protection, get a home inspection. This is a required document in our brokerage, even though this is technically an FHA form. The reason we've made this required is because it explains to the buyer the importance of having an inspection, what is radon gas. It explains all that to them. The reason that we've made it required is because so many buyers have been waiving inspections, and I'm just waiting for that to turn into a lawsuit against the agents that you told me not to do an inspection. No, we don't tell our clients not to do an inspection. If you chose not to do an inspection, that's on you. So this form forces you to check that I choose to have a home inspection or I choose not to have a home inspection. So we're advising our clients that they should have one. And if you don't want one, then that's on you. You can check here. I also always check that I've received a list of at least 3 qualified inspectors. You don't have to give a list of 3 qualified inspectors, but if you give one inspector, you have to give at least 3. You cannot give 1 or 2 names only. You can give 0, 3 or more. What I've done for myself, just I guess maybe a tip if you guys want to do the same, I created a separate document with my list of 3 inspectors. And that when I present this offer to my buyer, that's going to be the very next page. Snuck in here is going to be, so they're saying, yes, they've received a list of 3 qualified inspectors, and now you're going to sign this extra document that I've created so that we all know that you've received these 3 qualified inspectors. This is the removal of contingency form. So once we've gotten, we've got our offer accepted, we've done our home inspection. We're gonna use this form now to remove that general home inspection and whatever other inspections you may have had. You're gonna remove it, or you're gonna remove it subject to conditions. So subject to condition would be seller to clean the mold in the attic. Be specific, as specific as you guys want to be with that stuff. So in other words, if you don't care, say an outlet in the kitchen is not GFCI protected, and it should be. I don't really care if that's done by an electrician or the homeowner or a handyman, as long as it's done properly. So I'll just say change the GFCI outlets in the kitchen, change the outlets in the kitchen to be GFCI protected outlet. But if it's something like mold in the attic, I don't necessarily want the homeowner just going up in the attic with a bottle of bleach and cleaning the mold and not doing it properly, and we still have a problem in the future. So if it's something like mold remediation, I usually say to be work to be completed by a professional mold remediation company and provided a transferable warranty. So that's the way I usually write it for something like that. You know, electrical issue that's not just changing an outlet, it's double tapped wires or a bad breaker or something where you want an electrician or want a plumber or a specific trade to do the work. Be specific on this form to include that. And if this is not enough space for you to write everything that you need to write, I usually just write C attachment, and then I will create a Word document and I will list it all out there. And this is the America's Preferred Home Warranty. This is also a required document. If they're not getting America's Preferred Home Warranty and they're getting another home warranty, this is still a document that we need. If they're choosing not to have any home warranty, this is still a document we need. And if they're getting America's Preferred Home Warranty, of course, we need this document. You'll fill out all the information up here. They're accepting a warranty, buyer and seller will sign here. And if they're choosing not to have this warranty because they're getting a warranty from Old Republic or old whatever they're called, HSA maybe, then we'll just have the buyer sign the waiver. The reason we need this document is because if there's ever a lawsuit with where we're involved, if we're ever called into a lawsuit about this transaction, America's Preferred Home Warranty will help us with our legal defense only if we've given our clients the opportunity to receive a home warranty. So as long as we've given them the opportunity, whether they chose to take America's Preferred Home Warranty or not, the company will cover a portion of our legal expenses for that lawsuit. So that's why that's required. Xavier, you had asked about the other document. So it's called Post-Closing Possession Addendum Statewide. That's the name of the addendum that we would use if the seller is going to stay in the property after closing. Okay, so to fill this form out, address here, possession, they'll have 5 days, 10 days, 30 days, whatever, however many days you agree to. By the way, if your client is getting a mortgage that's not intended for an investment property, you cannot exceed 59 days. 60 becomes an investment property and their mortgage will change. Their closing costs will change. So if you're doing this, make sure that you don't exceed 59 days. So they'll have for 59 days until 6 p.m. Or on April 15th, whatever you guys, if you want to use a calendar day instead of a number of days. How much rent are they paying? We calculate the rent per day. So if they've got, 30 bucks a day of rent, then, and they're staying for 15 days, do the math. I don't know. My brain's not going to do it now, but you can, so you would put in $30 a day here. I've done quite a few where we've allowed a rent back at $0 per day. So we write in zero there, whatever the number is that you guys agree on, put that in there. Security deposit. This actually just came up with one of our agents the other day where they are giving free rent. I suggested putting in some sort of security deposit, whatever number you guys your buyers are comfortable with. That security deposit is just to make sure that they don't cause any damage to the property. It says that money is being held by the buyer, so it's going to be paid to the buyer at closing through escrow. I don't love that. I'm usually crossing that out and putting escrow agent there. So they're not going to actually give that money to the buyer. They're just going to hold it in escrow until the seller's moved out. We check it. There's no damage. We write an addendum saying, okay, return the security deposit to the seller. And that's it. If there is damage, obviously, then you need to get receipts and then say, you know what, we have $500 worth of damage. Here's the receipts for that work. We're returning $500 to the buyer and $500 to the seller. Buyer's right to inspect. So the buyers have the right to come in and inspect the house to make sure that it's not vacant. And of course, to deliver keys and everything like that. I always tell my clients, if they're doing this, I said, you're going to be a landlord, whether it's 2 days or 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever, you're a landlord and there are landlord tenant laws. You need to be aware of them. So, and we're not attorneys, so we're not giving that advice of what those laws really mean and how you need to behave as a landlord. You need to do your own homework now that you're a landlord, even if it's only for 2 days. Utilities, seller's gonna maintain utilities in their name until possession. Maintenance of the property says that the seller will promptly inform the buyer of any repairs in excess of, you can leave it blank, and if you leave it blank, it's $100. So if the repairs are less than $100, the seller has the right to make that repair and then collect the money back from the buyer, I guess. And then if it's an emergency, obviously they can do any repair that's needed. If it's an emergency repair, and if it's the repair is not an emergency and it's in excess of $100 or whatever number you guys are comfortable with, then they have to get permission from the buyer before making that repair.
So
They're
have
gonna,
you ever seen, going back up to, I think it was line 30, 31, the utilities? How
Mhm.
do they, so it says that the seller is responsible to pay those if they're staying on the property. How do they typically work that out? Do they keep it in the seller's name?
Yep. Yeah,
Okay,
the water
gotcha.
sewer is always the problem child.
Okay.
Because
Oh, I
remember
see.
we
All
talked,
utilities are
yeah,
in the
I mean,
seller's name.
gas and
Okay,
electric, they just keep that in their name. Cable, that'll stay in their name. Water
gotcha.
and
Okay.
sewer is always the problem because water and sewer stays with the property. They will not, the water department, I've I've got lots of stories, I guess. I had a seller who was granted a 2-month stay after title transfer.
Mhm.
Um, they thought they were doing the right thing because we had agreed that all utilities were going to stay in the seller's name. So water, sewer, gas, electric, they just didn't change anything. They kept on living there for 2 months. And the 2 months passed and they moved out. And that's when they called Cleveland Water and Northeast Ohio Sewer District to turn it over into the, out of their name for the water and sewer. And what Cleveland Water said was, oh, you sold this house 2 months ago. We can see through the public records and through these meters, they can see an actual real-time reading on any meter. Oh, you sold this 2 months ago. We've been billing you in error. We're going to refund you 2 months worth of water that you've paid, and we're going to bill it to the buyer who owned the house 2 months ago. And it just turned into a big mess. Seller thought they were doing the right thing because they had agreed to pay the water and sewer, and then they ended up getting this giant refund from Cleveland Water, and then we had to straighten it out with the seller. Luckily, or with the buyer. Luckily, buyer and seller in that case were all good people, so we were able to straighten it out. But it's just so you know, when you're explaining this to a buyer, you can tell them that the water and sewer is going to be the one problem child here, where they're going to bill it to you as the owner on the day of closing. So, if it's just a few days, most people don't usually care about a few days. If it's more than a few days, maybe you guys have to work out some other arrangement for the water and sewer charges.
Okay.
Okay. Complying with laws, make sure that your client is aware of landlord tenant laws um, with occupying a property, risk of casualty and loss. Um, the seller is going to have to insure the property. Um, but I'm sorry, your buyer will insure the property now that they own the property. They have to have homeowners insurance on the property, but homeowners insurance is not going to cover your tenant's belongings. So, um, a tree fell on the house, your homeowner insurance is gonna get you a new roof on your house, that's fine, but all the furniture that was in the bedroom that got damaged during that incident, that doesn't belong to you, that belongs to the seller, that's not gonna get covered by our insurance, so you're gonna need to get your own renter's insurance policy. So it explains here that the buyer's insurance will not cover the seller's belongings, and if the seller wants to insure their belongings, they're gonna have to get a renter's insurance policy. They're indemnifying the brokers, where, with regards to the rental policy, with the rental agreement. Um, in other words, if the seller decides not to move out, you can't come after Keller Williams, or you guys as the agents. If the seller defaults, this is gonna explain, if they terminate, if they move out early or if they don't pay, it's all outlined here. And then buyer and seller will sign. Questions about this document? Going once, going twice. I think that's it, guys. That's my class. I lost a few of you guys, but thanks for sticking around, to everybody who could stay the whole time. If you guys have any questions later on, want to reach out to me, call, text, email is fine. That's it. That's all I got for you guys today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.